Transportation is meant to do one thing above all else. It's meant to reduce you, to strip away any rank you ever had. Henry Browne Hayes is sentenced to transportation for life. And in late 1801, he's put on a convict ship bound for New South Wales. On paper, this is exile. In reality, Hayes treats it merely like an inconvenience. The ship is called the Atlantis, and before it even leaves port, Henry Browne Hayes starts doing what he's always done best. He starts negotiating. He pays the captain bribes, around £200, and in return he does not travel like the rest of the convicts. He gets a private cabin, freedom of deck. He eats with the officers. He even brings a servant. Well, think about that. Transportation was being used against ordinary people to flatten them. Convicts, criminals, but also political prisoners. And Hayes arrives on the Atlas, already proving that for some, punishment is flexible. Now, Corda, we don't just look at the Atlas as just a ship. It's a cross-section of Ireland at the turn of the 19th century. Below deck are ordinary convicts, men transported for theft, hunger, desperation, a product of the society they grew up in. But mixed in with them, there are Irish political prisoners, men the authorities explicitly label as rebels. The aftermath of 1798, United Irishmen Rebellion, is being cleared out. And this is important. Hayes is not crossing the world alone. There's an irony there. One of the men on board, for example, is a man named Tristram Moore from County Derry, Cúnta Dura. Moore is not a thief. He's not recorded as one of those convicts. He's recorded in documents as an Irish rebel. He's in his mid-30s. He's been sentenced to life. And he's described as a chemist. In other words, he's educated, articulate, someone the state considers politically dangerous. Now, Moore doesn't accept his fate quietly. A few years after arriving in New South Wales, he attempts to escape in an open boat, one of those desperate, near-suicidal bids to outrun an empire with nothing but wood, water and hope. And he's caught. But the attempt tells you something. Moore resisted the system head on. So picture the crossing. Henry Browne Hayes, a disgraced knight of the empire, dining with officers, walking the deck, insulated from the hold below him, and men, rebels, like Tristram Moore, political prisoners, enduring the voyage as punishment, not inconvenience. The same ship, the same destination, opposite meanings. There's an irony again at the heart of Hayes's exile. He's being removed from Ireland because the system has finally decided that he is a problem. But he's travelling in the company of men who were always treated as problems. Men for whom transportation was not just symbolic, it was brutal. And when the Atlas finally reaches Sydney in 1802, the difference will become impossible to ignore. You're listening to Undercover Irish, where we uncover Ireland's hidden curriculum. This show is made possible by listener support. If you enjoy the work and you want to help sustain it, you can support the show on Patreon. Just search Undercover Irish. Corda Arigling. When the Atlas finally reaches Sydney in 1802, Henry Browne Hayes steps ashore as a convict. But nothing about his behaviour suggests that identity has settled in with him. Within weeks, he's back into conflict. He's fighting with authority figures. He threatens, he oversteps. This is not the quiet compliance of a man who's been affected by exile in the way people normally would be. It's the familiar impatience of someone who believes he should still be in charge. And the colonial authorities, those upholders of empire, they respond quickly. He's punished, confined, reminded bluntly of what his status is now meant to be. Now, this tells us something essential about him. Australia and transportation do not change Henry Browne Hayes. It reveals more about him. Transportation is meant to break, but Hayes never accepts limits. Not in Cork, in Kirkig, not in court, not even on the other side of the world. This is the first truth about Hayes' exile. He's not learning, he's adapting. And for him, adapting, a man like this, means rebuilding. Rebuilding power and even rebuilding place. In 1803, barely a year after arriving, Henry Browne Hayes does something that would have felt almost impossible for an ordinary transported convict. He acquires land, not in the town, not near the barracks, out at South Head, in what was then a secluded pocket of harbour landscape, a valley backed by dense bush and for a long time accessible mainly by boat. And this gives us an idea of where his head is still at. The name Vaucluse, a European name, linked in several accounts to the Fontaine de Vaucluse in southern France, a little piece of continental romance planted on the edge of a penal colony. And then he builds. The first structure is not the grand Gothic pile you can visit today. That comes later under William Charles Wentworth, beginning in the late 1820s. Hayes's Vaucluse is smaller, cottage, huts, outbuildings. But what matters most is the ambition behind it. He clears land, about 50 acres according to heritage summaries, and starts turning what one person would describe as a mere waste into a working estate. By the time Hayes is preparing to leave the colony, he's listing the place almost like a prospectus. 2 houses, a kitchen, an outhouse, stockyards, cleared land, garden, fruit trees, even asparagus beds. So don't picture a broken man learning humility. This is a man who's never lost his grandeur, his belief in the world owing him, and he's trying to re-establish it. And this is where we see the mirror of Vernon Mount, because Vaucluse isn't just shelter, it's a statement. It's a building of a country seat, set apart, elevated, framed by water and distance. He's trying to recreate the same social theatre he performed on in Cork. Later, Wentworth will expand that original cottage into larger Gothic revival mansion, turrets, wings, service buildings, stables, building status into the landscape for a new colonial elite. But the spine of it, the earliest fabric, begins with Hayes. Parts of his original cottages are understood to survive inside the later house, swallowed by the bigger additions like a secret core. And that's the whole point. Transportation was meant to punish Hayes, but he didn't let it. He builds a house, he builds a name, he builds a life that looks, from a certain angle, almost respectable. And once you see him doing that, once you see him rebuilding status on the edges of the harbour, the next move makes perfect sense. Because Hayes doesn't just build a building, he starts to build networks. Back in Cork, at Vernon Mount, the symbolism was subtle. Geometry in the layout, balance in the proportions, order made visible in stone. Just enough for the right people to recognise. That same language crosses the world with Henry Browne Hayes. Because exile removes land and title, but it doesn't remove beliefs, and it doesn't remove old networks. When Hayes begins building at Vaucluse, the echoes are unmistakable. Elevation, separation, a house positioned not just to shelter, but to overlook. This is the architecture doing social work. And the names matter too. Vaucluse gestures towards Europe and European refinement. But the wider symbolic world Hayes draws from is older and more deliberate. Freemasonry. By the early 19th century, Freemasonry is a trans-imperial network. It crosses borders, oceans, and regimes. It survives rebellions, revolutions, war, and transportation in this case. It offers fraternity, brotherhood, where institutions fracture, and continuity and privilege, where punishment is supposed to sever ties. And Hayes is deeply at home in that world. In New South Wales, Hayes moves quickly. In 1803, just a year after his arrival, he attempts to establish a Masonic lodge in Sydney. Australian Masonic histories later describe this moment as a kind of a dawn, not fully legitimate beginning, but an early signal that Freemasonry had arrived in the colony. But at that time, it's anything but ceremonial. The meeting is held in a private house. Governor King breaks it up. Those present are arrested, but then quietly released. No charges, just a warning. But nevertheless, he has established Freemasonry in Australia at this point, hoping to recreate the networks that aided him all the way through his life. Despite everything, the crime, the outrage, the embarrassment, Henry Browne Hayes survives again. He's punished, he moves, he's restricted, but he's not erased. And it's difficult to ignore the pattern, the symbols that follow him, the networks that seem to reappear. And the man who believed in hidden structures finds himself once again moving through them. Accorda, by the first decade of the 19th century, New South Wales is no longer just a prison, it's a pressure cooker. A colony held together by forced labour, military authority, and land that has been taken, stolen. This settlement exists on Eora country, land cared for by Aboriginal clans for thousands of years. It's now been seized by the British Empire and reshaped as Sydney spreads outwards from the harbour. And it's worth saying this clearly. None of the power struggles that follow question that reality. They assume it. They're arguments about who controls the colony, not whether the colony should exist at all. Because by the early 1800s, New South Wales is being run on contradiction. Officially, it's governed by the Crown. In practice, it's dominated by the New South Wales Corps, officers who control trade, labour and supply. Rum functions as currency. Private profit trumps regulation. Authority is enforced selectively. And into this unstable colonial system steps William Bligh. He's appointed governor in 1806. He's rigid, blunt, uncompromising. He tries to dismantle the rum economy and rein in the officers who benefit from it. What follows is the Rum Rebellion, the only successful military coup in modern Australian history. In January 1808, Bligh is arrested by his own officers. Power fractures. The colony continues but under different management. The land remains taken. The labour remains coerced. Only the men giving the orders have changed. And Henry Browne Hayes is watching all of this very carefully, because moments like this force choices. Not moral choices, but political ones. And Henry Browne Hayes chooses his side. He backs Governor William Bligh. On the surface, it might look principled. Bligh represents lawful authority, the Crown, order, regulation. The officers represent corruption, rum, private profit, open defiance. But beneath that, there's something more familiar at work. Hayes has always believed in his structure. Hierarchy where he's up the top. Legitimacy. The idea that if you attach yourself to the right framework, power will eventually right itself. And Bligh fits his worldview. The officers do not. But Hayes misreads the situation. because New South Wales at that moment does not reward him. It rewards force. Bligh is arrested. The officers take control. The coup succeeds. And just like that, Henry is on the wrong side of power again. He doesn't stay quiet. He mocks the new order. He speaks too freely, refuses to pretend that the reversal is legitimate. And this time, there's no ambiguity about how the authorities see him. Not as a gentleman, not as a reformer, but as a problem. Hayes is arrested. He's sent north to Newcastle, then known as Coal River, a secondary penal settlement, an exile within exile. Newcastle is built for punishment, hard labour, isolation, surveillance. It sits on Awabakal land, another place where dispossession and discipline overlap, where convicts are forced to work and Indigenous people are forced aside. This is not Sydney. There are no drawing rooms here, no houses to build, no networks to cultivate. For the first time since leaving Ireland, Hayes is reduced to something close to what transportation was meant to achieve: restriction, obscurity. The man who rebuilt himself through architecture and association is now cut off from both. This is what misreading power costs. Not execution, not redemption, but disappearance, being placed somewhere designed to forget you. Yet even here and even now, Henry Browne Hayes survives. Newcastle does not break Henry Browne Hayes, but it does silence him for a time at least. He works, he waits, he survives. And while he's out of sight, the colony itself begins to shift again. The Rum Rebellion does not last. Governor Bligh is eventually vindicated, not in Sydney, but in London. And when Lachlan Macquarie arrives as governor in 1810, he inherits a place badly in need of repair. Macquarie believes in order, but also in rehabilitation. He wants the colony to stabilise. He wants to move forward, to stop endlessly relighting old conflicts. And that means reassessing men who have already served their usefulness to dishonour. This is where the story becomes a bit less tidy. Officially, Hayes's path to release, runs through paperwork, pardon drawn up under Bligh and later honoured by Macquarie. But back in Cork and in later accounts, another story circulates. That Hayes's daughter, moving in the so-called right social circles, uses her access to power to press his case. That she caught the attention of the Prince Regent at a society event in Brighton. That she pleaded. Whether that intervention was decisive or merely helpful, it's impossible to say with certainty. But the story itself fits the pattern. Hayes rarely survives on punishment alone. He survives on connections. In this new political climate, the paperwork aligned, reputation softened, and old grudges no longer become urgent. A pardon is prepared. Not immediately honoured, but publicly celebrated. Just placed on file and reactivated when it becomes convenient. And that moment comes in 1812. After more than a decade in New South Wales, Henry Browne Hayes is permitted to leave the colony. It's not forgiveness, it's an administrative closure, a decision that he is no longer worth keeping. And that distinction matters because nothing in this process suggests that Hayes has been redeemed. He hasn't recanted, he hasn't apologised, he hasn't been transformed. But incredibly, a decade after his transportation, he now ends up boarding a ship bound for Ireland. What Hayes cannot know, and what no one on the dock can know, is that his final test will not come in court or colony or house. It will come at sea. In late 1812, Henry Browne Hayes finally leaves New South Wales. He boards a ship called the Isabella. On paper, this is the homeward journey, the reward for endurance, the closing of the circle. But once again, the story refuses to travel in a straight line. because Hayes is not the only Irishman on board. Among the passengers are men who were transported not for crime, but for politics. United Irishmen, veterans of a rebellion that failed, but never quite disappeared. Men who were exiled because they imagined a different Ireland and paid for it with their removal. And one of them was Joseph Holt, a leading United Irish figure, a commander in 1798 in the rebellion, a man who has already endured years of exile. Holt is travelling with his family, and he kept a journal. And because of that, we get something rare, a witness. In February 1813, the Isabella strikes trouble in the South Atlantic. She was wrecked at Las Islas Malvinas, what the British will call the Falklands, or what the British called the Falklands. Las Islas Malvinas. Rock, wind, darkness. The ship begins to break apart. Panic spreads and orders are shouted, boats are lowered. And this is the moment where stories either collapse or tell the truth. According to Holt's account, Henry Browne Hayes forces his way into the first boat. He takes oars and rows for shore, women and children left behind on the wreck. Eventually, everyone survives. Ropes are rigged, makeshift systems are devised, families are hauled to safety. But the order of survival was already established, and it's unmistakable. Think about it here. Joseph Holt, a man exiled for rebellion, stays with his family, records the ordeal, endures it collectively, whereas Henry Browne Hayes, a man exiled for violence, grabs the first advantage he can and goes. Same wreck, same island, same danger, different instincts. This is the moment where structures fall away. No courts, no houses, no symbols, no networks. Just fear. And when that happens, Henry Browne Hayes behaves exactly as he always has. His survival first. And the United Irishman, the rebel, becomes the moral witness. Stranded together on the bleak shore at the edge of the map, these men wait for rescue. A knight and a rebel, both removed by empire. Only one of them still believes he deserves more. Hayes will make it home, but the sea has already delivered its verdict on him. And it's hard not to compare and contrast the actions of both men with the politics that they embody. One of the Protestant ascendancy, born in privilege. One, a person who strove for equality between people. After rescue from Las Islas Malvinas, Henry Browne Hayes eventually makes his way back across the Atlantic, back to Ireland, back to Cork, back to Kirkig. But this is not a homecoming. The Cork he returns to is not the Cork he left. The title still exists on paper, the name is still known, but now uncomfortably. The world that once bent around him has moved on. Hayes lives out the remainder of his life quietly, not restored, not celebrated, barely tolerated. A man people remember just enough to avoid. Exile did not transform him into a hero, and return did not restore him back into a so-called gentleman. He survives, but he does not recover his place. The system that once protected him has learned how to keep its distance from him. And yet survival alone is not justice. Because while Henry Browne Hayes is allowed to re-enter the world, the person whose life he shattered never truly does. Mary Pike lives for decades after the trial. She's not forgotten. She remains wealthy on paper. She's safe. But the accounts agree on what matter most. She withdraws. She avoids men. She lives under care and protection. Her world narrows and closes in. The details differ from source to source. Some describe retreat, some describe supervision, some use the blunt language of fear. But the pattern is unmistakable. Mary Pike never really resumes her life. she endures it. And here's a detail that should stop you. Henry Browne Hayes and Mary Pike both die in the same year, 1832, the same year. Two lives permanently linked by one act of violence. Hayes dies having travelled the world. Mary dies having retreated from it. His punishment ends. Hers does not. If you walk through the present with this story in mind, the past doesn't feel so distant. It's still under your feet. Vernon Mount still sits on top of a hill on the south side of Cork City, but it's now a burnt-out shell, hollow, ruined, gone. Much like the Protestant ascendancy that once ruled Ireland with an iron fist. The system didn't collapse overnight, but it did collapse. What remains of it smoulders on in the 6 counties of the north in the aftermath of partition and in a state created to preserve that old order. On the Grand Parade, Shroyd and Coppelbuy, 3 bow-fronted buildings still stand overlooking the heart of Cork City, Caherchurky, built with the reward money, built from betrayal, who knows, linked to Colin or Coughlin the barber, the man who handed Henry Browne Hayes in. They're ordinary now, but they're still there. Half the world away, Vaucluse House stands too. Once the estate of a transported convict who refused to disappear or to give up his old life, later reshaped by governors and colonial elites. Now a museum, a site of tourism. School groups will walk through it. Guides will talk about architecture, gardens, views of the harbour. It's preserved, not as a crime scene, but as heritage. And that contrast matters. Some names endure today in different ways. John Philpott Curran has a street named after him at the top of Shannon Street on Cork's north side. A man remembered not for power but resistance to it. The name Penrose still runs along one of Cork's most prominent quays, a reminder of Cooper Penrose, the man who pursued justice when silence might have been easier. Henry Browne Hayes, by contrast, is buried in a crypt deep beneath Christ Church on South Main Street, once the spiritual and social centre of his class's power, now quiet, relatively unvisited, and almost hidden. And then there is Australia, a former British colony built on the displacement of its Aboriginal people, a country that has achieved independence and now stands on the edge possibly of becoming a republic. It still carries deep scars of dispossession, scars that have not healed simply because flags may change or might have changed. The land Hayes built on was never empty, was taken, just as Irish land before that was taken. Different places, same logic. The political objectives of men like Joseph Holt and the other Irish prisoners from the United Irish, for example, transported across the world, were never fully realised. Partition still exists. Equality is still unfinished. And their political descendants are still arguing for what was denied. And at the centre of all of this, quite painfully, is Mary Pike. She left no movement behind her, no street name, no building. Her legacy is not of stone or inscription. It's of absence, withdrawal, a life narrowed by violence. So the question remains, and these are not historical. If this is what happened to a wealthy heiress, surrounded by protection and influence, what happened at the time to working class women, to servants, to labourers' daughters, to women without names that were recorded? And today, are we really so sure that the law treats everyone equally? Or does class still soften consequences for some people? Does wealth still buy distance? Does power still decide who is to be believed? And who is quietly absorbed into the background? Acáirde gur míle maithagad asacht bhealm. Thank you so much for being with me on this episode. Please share with a friend, follow on social media. Until the next time, acáirde, a raigling, slán go fóill agus berigi bua.